Hey everybody! Today I would like to discuss the topic of theoretical identifications. This is a topic that has fascinated philosophers for a very long time, and so I thought I would like to make a video to explain some of the major positions and results on this topic, and to give a few of my own opinions. Alright, so what is this topic? What do I mean by theoretical identification? Basically, the subject of this video is various issues concerning the beliefs, statements, and facts that make assertions of identity. In other words, we're concerned with propositions and facts that have the form A equals B. Sometimes in the course of inquiry, there will be occasions where, pre-theoretically, we thought that there were two objects that were distinct. But then, as inquiry evolves, reason or observation will compel us to change our minds and conclude that there was actually only one object all along. The subject of this video is to understand what is going on in these cases. Let me give two examples. These examples are very widely used in the philosophical literature, to the point of being cliched. But that's okay. I want to use the cliched examples because I want to say some things about them that aren't so commonplace. The first example is the one that concerns Hesperus and phosphorus. This example was first introduced into the literature by the philosopher Gottlob Frege. So here's how the story goes. A long time ago, in ancient Greece, the ancient astronomers observed a star in the sky during the evening and called that star the evening star, or Hesperus. They also observed a star in the sky during the morning, and they called it the morning star, or Phosphorus. At first, they had no idea that Hesperus and Phosphorus were actually one and the same celestial body. But as time went on, once astronomical science became more sophisticated, the Greeks were eventually able to discover that all along Hesperus was the very same thing as Phosphorus. Indeed, it turned out that Hesperus, i.e. Phosphorus, wasn't a star at all. It was the planet Venus. So the natural thing to say is that the Greeks learned something that day. They discovered a new fact. They obtained a new true belief that Hesperus is identical to Phosphorus. Okay, so that's one very common example of a theoretical identification. The other one that is widely used in the philosophical community is the identification of water and H2O. I actually think that this example is overused, for reasons that I will get to later. Anyway, here's how philosophers will typically tell the story. First of all, humans have had the concept of water for pretty much our entire existence. But then, one day, sometime in the early 19th century, we developed the modern theory of chemical composition. During this period, we discovered the identity of water. We discovered that water is H2O. This is alleged to be a theoretical identification between two things. We discovered that water is identical to H2O. So there's another identity fact that our scientific theory has discovered. So I said I wanted to discuss the philosophy of these identity statements and these identity facts. I'm going to divide this video up into two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the metaphysics of identity facts. And then in the second part, I'm going to say a bit about the epistemology of beliefs about identity. But before we get any deeper into the weeds, let me first give you a sense of why this has been such an important topic for philosophy. It's worth mentioning now that one of the landmark texts of 20th century analytic philosophy was devoted to this topic. The text I'm talking about is, of course, Saul Kripke's book, Naming a Necessity, which was based off of material that Kripke developed in the 1970s. I mention this book now because A lot of people consider it to be the definitive text on this subject, and so I'm going to be referring to it quite often. Okay, so as far as I can tell, there are two main reasons why this has been such a hot topic in philosophy. The first one comes from the fact that there are a number of theories throughout numerous disciplines that take the form of theoretical identifications. So, for example, when Kripke wrote his book in the mid 20th century, it was very common for naturalistic philosophers who were interested in the relationship between the mind and the body to tout a theory they called the mind-body identity theory. The idea was that perhaps mental states like pain and pleasure, beliefs and desires can be thought of as identical to certain brain states, in much the same way that water is identical to H2O. Perhaps the various mental states are identical to the brain states that they are found to correlate with in like an fMRI scan. Anyway, to my knowledge, I'm not so sure that this is still a very popular view these days within philosophy of mind, but there are many other identity theories in many other branches of philosophy that are still very popular. So consider, for instance, that you can find identity claims made all over the place in metaethics. Just to give a few examples, some naturalistic philosophers have claimed that the property of goodness is identical to some natural property, such as the promotion of human flourishing or the promotion of sentient flourishing. That's an identity claim. Or, for another example, many theists have tried to claim that ethical obligation is identical to commandments made by God. So this issue of identity has application in the philosophy of religion as well. The other main reason for why this topic has been so significant is because it has ramifications for our understanding of analyticity, a prioricity, and necessity. I'll give a proper introduction of these things when they become relevant, but for now, I'm just going to say this. Each one of these notions has had a distinguished role in the history of Western philosophy. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that entire movements or schools of thought were defined by their views on analyticity, a prioricity, and necessity. Some cases in point include the empiricist tradition, the rationalist tradition, and Kantian idealism from early modern philosophy. Each one of these has their own distinctive views on the relationship between analyticity, a prioricity, and necessity. Hopefully I'll be able to say and give some flavor of this during the video. But suffice to say that the lessons that we learn about identification can make or break some of these views. Let's now begin with part one. So in this part, I'm going to talk about the metaphysics of facts of identity. The principal result on this topic is going to be that the facts of identity are necessary. We owe this result to Ruth Barkin Marcus and Saul Kripke. So the result is that if two things are identical, then they are necessarily identical. There is no possible situation in which they are not identical. So if I were to just tell you that that's the main result, it probably won't seem like a big deal. In order to really understand why this is a big deal, we need to consider just how influential the philosophy of empiricism was from the time period between the 1700s and the mid-20th century. So let me just say a bit about that. So what is empiricism? Empiricism historically has been the view that all of our concepts and all of the substantial discoveries we make must ultimately be traceable to sense experience. For the empiricist, all substantial knowledge about the world must come from experience. So that means that if there's any knowledge that isn't derived from experience, perhaps maybe the truths of logic or arithmetic, then it must be the case that that knowledge doesn't substantively inform us about how things are in the world. Rather, if you're an empiricist, you would think that any knowledge we get a priori, i.e., independent of experience, would at most be a matter of just unpacking our own concepts or unpacking the meanings of the terms of our language. Another way to put this is that for the empiricist, all a priori knowledge must be analytic. That is, true just by virtue of the meanings of our language or our concepts, rather than true in virtue of the facts of the mind-independent world. Okay, so that's empiricism in a nutshell. Like I said, this view was tremendously popular for a good chunk of recent history. What I just said is probably a decent portrayal of the philosophies of David Hume and Rudolf Carnap. Anyway, the reason why this is relevant to our topic is because traditional empiricism must then take a fairly deflationary take on necessity. So this idea goes back to David Hume. Hume realized that if empiricism is true, and we only ever get knowledge about the world through experience, well, we only ever experience how things are. We don't experience how things must be, how things necessarily are. We don't experience how things could be or how they possibly are. In other words, we don't glean the truths of necessity from our experience alone. So, if you're a strict empiricist, then the notions of necessity and possibility must be suspect to you. The solution for the empiricist is they must hold that the facts of necessity and possibility are not to be understood as derived from how things are out there in the world. For them, the world in and of itself is entirely non-modal. It doesn't possess modal attributes like possibility and necessity. The mind-independent facts are strictly non-modal. For the empiricist, this means that all facts about what is necessary and what is possible must then be explained by how we conceptualize the world. They must be somehow derivable from our concepts. Okay, so this brings us to a very substantial thesis that historically has been held by many empiricists of the past. The thesis can be put like this: all necessary truths must be conceptual truths. As Hume put it, or as Hume would put it, necessary truths report relations between our own ideas rather than state matters of fact. Or, as Carnap would put it, all necessary truths are analytic. That is, they are true just in virtue of the meanings of the relevant terms in which we formulate the truth. Having now given you this background, let's see how certain identity facts can cause problems for the empiricist thesis. Consider again the case of Hesperus and phosphorus. Here's how this case causes problems for the analytic theory of necessity according to the popular philosophical imagination. I'm just going to say as an aside that I don't entirely endorse every aspect of the way I'm about to tell this story. I'm just going to repeat how this story is typically told. And then in the next section, I'm going to raise some of my own worries. Okay, so the first thing to say, that people say, that Kripke said, is that the discovery that Hesperus is phosphorus was indeed a substantial discovery. Moreover, they say that it was an empirical discovery. We learned a new fact about the world. We gained a new empirical belief when we discovered that Hesperus was phosphorus all along. Finally, also worth saying is that Hesperus is identical to phosphorus is not to be construed as an analytic truth. It's not true just in virtue of the meanings or our concepts associated with the terms Hesperus and phosphorus. But if that is right, then it would also follow from traditional empiricism that the identity of Hesperus and phosphorus could not be a necessary fact. But then we can throw a wrench into empiricism because, as a matter of fact, we can prove using logic that it must be a necessary fact. Now, I'm going to go through the proof. You can see the lines of the proof on the screen. I'll present them. I believe that this proof originates from the logician Ruth Barkin Marcus. Okay, so here's how it goes. Step 1. We suppose that Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. Let's just write that briefly as H equals P. Now, Leibniz's law tells us that if H is identical to P, then they must share all of the same properties. For all properties F, if H is identical to P, then H bears F if and only if P bears F. Okay, so now let this property be the property of being necessarily identical to Hesperus. So then it follows, just from substituting that property into Leibniz's law and using modus ponens, that necessarily Hesperus is identical to Hesperus if and only if necessarily Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. But here's another premise. Clearly, it's necessary that Hesperus is identical to Hesperus. So then it follows from line 4 that we get the conclusion. Necessarily, Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. Here we have a proof that if Hesperus is identical to phosphorus, then this must be a fact of necessity. Necessarily, Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. Now, since we've already noted that this is an empirical truth and it's not an analytic truth, i.e. it's a synthetic truth, this spells trouble for empiricism. Their analytic analytic theory of necessity has been allegedly disproven. Before I move on to my next point, I want to make one quick side point about the necessity of identity. This will just be a quick tangent about the concept of rigid designators. If you were to ask the typical philosophy student why identity is a necessary relation, they might say something about rigid designation, because that's how Kripke originally approached this topic. I'm not going to explain this in very much detail, but I actually think that this is a circuitous way to think about this topic. Let me just briefly say that in order for Kripke's rigid designator story to work, you have to presuppose that identity is a necessary relation to begin with. But then, if you already have presupposed that and you have this proof, then talk of rigid designation is superfluous. Okay, so let's get back to the main train of thought. We've now shown that Hesperus is necessarily identical to phosphorus. Many people who read Kripke's Naming and Necessity leave with the impression that the very same lesson that we've already learned can be straightforwardly carried over to the other examples of theoretical identification. In particular, they think that we've shown that it is also necessary that water is H2O. I want to now spend some time to disabuse you of the idea that things are that simple. And the reason why things get so complicated actually turns out to be fairly interesting. If you look closely at the proof given above for why it's necessary that Hesperus is phosphorus, you'll notice that it is very important to this proof that the logical structure of the proposition that Hesperus is phosphorus is that it asserts an identity between individual objects. Another way to put this is that the proposition Hesperus is phosphorus has the form A is identical to B. What I want to suggest is that when you look at the statement water is H2O, it is not very plausible that it has the very same structure as an identity between individual objects. In particular, I don't think it's plausible that the is the is of identity and that H2O functions as a singular term referring to an individual object. Just as an aside, it's worth mentioning that Kripke himself is well aware of this. If you look at the footnotes in the book Naming a Necessity, you'll see that he deliberately fudges the syntax of this statement in order to make it easier to deliver his ideas. But I think this is actually unfortunate because his gloss on this ends up burying some interesting philosophy. So, having said that, what is the logical form of the proposition that water is H2O? I think that the most plausible reading of the statement is that water functions as a mass noun referring to a substance. The substance, of course, being water. And is H2O is a complex predicate. Is H2O, I think, can be paraphrased as something like, is the substance whose chemical composition is made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Some people sometimes suggest that maybe the statement water is H2O can be reread as asserting the identity of 2 properties. I don't think that that can be right. I don't think that we should ignore the fact that the term water functions as a mass noun. It doesn't refer to a property. Rather, it refers to a mass of stuff. You know, it refers to water. It refers to this stuff right here. How to understand what kind of object this nebulous mass of stuff is of course difficult. It's a difficult problem for metaphysics. We're just going to ignore that. Regardless, I think we need to respect the fact that the term water functions as a noun. Okay, so having said that, let's treat water is H2O as a complex subject-predicate statement. In that case, we can no longer use Barkin-Marcus's proof to establish that this statement is necessary, if true. Nonetheless, Kripke does in fact claim that this statement is necessary, and most people who read him think that he's right about this. And for what it's worth, I think he's right too. But now that we no longer can avail ourselves of the preceding proof, how do we make sense of this fact? The key is to invoke the notion of essence. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Aristotle. According to this thesis, each object or substance has its own essential nature. That is, each object has some select properties that make it what it is. If an object were to lack or part with one of its essential properties, then it would cease to exist. There would no longer be the same object. To see how this works, let's consider a different example that comes from Kripke. At one point when he was lecturing, Kripke pointed to the wooden lectern in front of him, and he proposed that this lectern is essentially made of wood. In particular, he proposed that this lectern could not have been made of ice. Why? Because if we were in a counterfactual situation where a lectern was made of ice and it was placed in front of him during that day and he was speaking in front of it, then it still would not have been the very same wooden lectern that was actually in front of him. It would have been a different lectern. I think what Kripke is saying here is highly intuitive. It's just an expression of common sense. This phone that I have could not have been made of ice. Why? Well, because if it were made of ice, then it would not have been the same phone. The general idea behind this bit of common sense is that artifactual objects are essentially made of their specific material. If you take an artifact and imagine it made out of some other material, then that is tantamount to imagining a numerically distinct artifact, a different object altogether. Okay, so now let's go back to water. Water is a substance. It's also a chemical kind. And we noted that it seems right to say that water is necessarily H2O. What I'd like to suggest now is that the necessity of water being H2O is best explained in terms of its essence. Water could not have been composed of anything else. That is because it's essentially composed of dihydrogen monoxide. If you try to imagine any substance that is composed of something other than dihydrogen monoxide, then you are imagining something that isn't water. So here's the general Kripkean and also Aristotelian story of what's going on here. When it comes to chemical kinds, their essence is to have the chemical composition that they have. Moreover, the Kripkean philosopher will say that we know this a priori. That is, we know a priori that whatever the chemical makeup of water turns out to be, that chemical makeup will be essential to water. So then, now, let's imagine we go back to the advent of modern chemical theory. We discover a posteriori that water has the property of being composed of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Now, when we combine this empirical discovery with our a priori knowledge of what would be the essential properties of a chemical kind, we can conclude a posteriori that water is necessarily H2O. This is, in my opinion, the strongest Kripkean argument for the existence of a posteriori knowledge of necessary truths. In short, we know a priori what sorts of properties would be essential to chemical kinds. And then we learn a posteriori what the essence of water actually is, namely being the substance composed of H2O. As a result, we know a posteriori that water is necessarily H2O. So given that we're now talking about a priori intuitions about essences, you can probably tell that we are now a long, long way away from the traditional empiricism. In fact, one of the things that's so striking about Kripke as a philosopher, with his hearkening back to Aristotle, is that he is such a radical departure from how the philosophers before him, who were gripped by empiricism, thought about these things. Come to think of it, I can hardly think of any philosophers between the 1600s and Kripke who had these Aristotelian tendencies. No doubt, some people will hear these aspects of Kripke and think this is a return to spooky occult metaphysics. Like, how can we really know a priori what would be the appropriate sorts of essential properties for artifacts or chemical kinds? And I admit, if you put it that way, it does sound very weird. But I want to say that, on the other hand, when we're not trying to be such hard-headed philosophers, these theses can actually seem very natural to us. Like, I think it's very natural to say that, of course, this phone couldn't have been made of ice. Why? Because this phone is what it is, and it couldn't have been anything else. And part of what makes it what it is that it's made of metal and plastic. Putting it that way, the essentialism seems very common sense. One final point for this section of the video. Does this Kripkean argument that I've given to you prove once and for all that empiricist anti-essentialism is wrong? I want to say, of course it doesn't. A hardline empiricist could always be skeptical of the essentialist intuitions that I'm appealing to. But I think this argument does show that common sense is on the side of rationalist essentialism and not empiricist anti-essentialism. Since the publication of Naming a Necessity, rationalist essentialism has been able to make a bit of a comeback. And that, I think, is a pretty good result. That concludes part 1 of this video. It's now time for part 2. It's time to get more sophisticated about the epistemology and the philosophy of language of the statements and beliefs of identity. In the last section, I gave you an argument which I claim to be the strongest Kripkean argument for the existence of the necessary a posteriori. And this argument involved theses about Aristotelian essences. But when most people think about the Kripkean necessary a posteriori, they don't think about essentialism at all. Rather, they think about the simple identity claims, such as the one about Hesperus and phosphorus. When I discussed this example earlier, I warned you that it wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed on the surface. and now it's time for me to say why that is. Let's recall some of the details from the story that I told before. Imagine that there's an ancient Greek astronomer living during the time that the identity of Hesperus and Phosphorus was discovered. Before the discovery was made, we can imagine him believing that Hesperus is identical to Hesperus. And we can imagine him believing that phosphorus is identical to phosphorus. We can imagine him believing these things because they seem obvious. They seem like they're trivial truths of logic. You don't need to make any observations, except perhaps to verify that Hesperus exists, in order to know that Hesperus is identical to Hesperus. Let's just say that he knows these things a priori. But what he doesn't believe, and he doesn't yet know, is that Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. And then one day, we imagine that he makes his discovery. However it happens, he figures it out that Hesperus and phosphorus are one and the same planet. And in that event, our Greek astronomer gains a new belief, a belief that he had not previously possessed. His new belief is that Hesperus is identical to phosphorus. Let's say that his belief also constitutes knowledge, and since his new belief was discovered on the basis of astronomical observation, we can conclude that his new knowledge is a posteriori. And then lastly, given the proof that I discussed before from Bark and Marcus, we can conclude that it's an instance of a necessary a posteriori knowledge. The story that I just told is, I think, probably fairly intuitive. And it would suffice to prove the existence of the necessary a posteriori. But there's just one problem. It only works if we're allowed to make some very controversial assumptions about what beliefs are. In fact, it's unclear whether the picture of belief that this story presupposes is even true. In order for me to present the problem, we're going to have to take many steps back and say a few words about just what belief is and what content is. Okay, so let's go back to the very beginning. Just what is a belief, anyway? What do you think a belief is? It actually turns out to be hard to say. I don't really know what a belief is. But what I can do for this video is just tell you what the most widely accepted answers are within the philosophical community. According to conventional wisdom, a belief is understood as an attitude that a subject bears towards a proposition. As an attitude, it's a relation that a subject bears to a proposition. On this view, two beliefs will be the same if they have the same propositional content. And two beliefs are distinct if they have distinct propositional content. Okay, so far so good. So then the next obvious step to make is to ask, what is a proposition? Again, it's hard to say. But once again, I can still tell you what the most commonly accepted answer is in the philosophical community. According to most philosophers, propositions are a kind of thing that bear the properties of truth and falsity. They are also the meanings of sentences. And they are the objects of our propositional attitudes. And that includes belief, but it also includes desires, intentions, and other psychological states. In this widely accepted picture of belief, notice that there are some substantive assumptions or claims that are being made or assumed. In particular, this picture assumes that the objects of our beliefs are the very same kind of thing as what our sentences mean. So there's this one-to-one correlation between our psychology and the meaning of public language. I will say that as an aside, that it's worth pondering whether that's actually true. I don't really know how to answer this myself. But for this video, once again, I'm just going to go along with popular opinion and assume that this is what propositions are. So now, having gotten this far, I can introduce a profound controversy within the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind. The controversy is concerned with how fine-grained propositions are. Some philosophers think that propositions are more fine-grained, and others think that they are more coarse-grained. There are two main positions in this dispute that are relevant for us, and I'm just going to go over each of them in turn. Okay, so the first view that one could take in this controversy is called Fregeanism, and it is of course named after the philosopher Gottlob Frege. And this view will be familiar to anyone who has read his paper, Sense and Reference. The basic idea of Frege is that propositions should be fine-grained enough to account for the differences in cognitive significance for thinking subjects. Here's how to illustrate this idea. Consider the sentence, Hesperus is Hesperus. This sentence seems to be a trivial truth of logic. It seems to express something that's knowable a priori. Then consider the sentence, Hesperus is phosphorus. What is said by this sentence would seem to have a different significance for our cognitive lives. It appears to be a non-trivial truth, and it seems that one could doubt that Hesperus is phosphorus, without thereby doubting that Hesperus is Hesperus. From these observations, Frege concluded that these sentences must express different propositions. So according to his theory, the belief that Hesperus is Hesperus really is distinct from the belief that Hesperus is phosphorus. They are different beliefs. The other main rival position is called the direct theory of reference, or also known as Millianism, after John Stuart Mill. According to this view, what a proper name like Hesperus means is none other than its referent. In other words, its meaning is identified with the object itself. In this case, the meaning of the term Hesperus would literally be identical to the planet Venus. It follows that on this view, propositions are more coarse-grained because they are individuated at the level of reference. So according to this view, the proposition expressed by Hesperus is phosphorus is literally one and the same proposition as what's expressed by Hesperus is Hesperus. Why? Because Hesperus means the same thing as phosphorus. They have the same referent. Okay, so now that we have these two rival positions, we can ask, which one of them is correct? Which one is right and which one is wrong? Well, I'm not going to, in this video, be able to declare a victor. This turns out to be another one of those very difficult issues. But I do think it's fair to say that most students who take an upper division philosophy of language course will be introduced to this topic by reading Frege's paper, Sense and Reference. Many of these students will leave then with the impression that the Fregean view is obviously the superior one. I would just like to say now that things aren't so simple. Frege wrote that paper in the 1890s, so about 130 years ago. But then, relatively recently, as in the 1980s, there emerged a lot of work that suggested that the Millian view was right all along. In particular, the most prominent works in this vein are Nathan Salmon's book, Frege's Puzzle, Saul Kripke's paper, A Puzzle About Belief, and Scott Soames' paper, Direct Reference, Propositional Attitudes, and Semantic Content. As things stand now, there are more philosophers who accept the Millian view than those who accept the Fregean view. Here, just to prove this, I'll display the results from the Phil paper survey on the screen. Just to be specific, this is um, the results displayed for people who specialize in the philosophy of language. Anyway, this is all just a way of me saying that the Fregean view of propositions isn't obviously the correct one. And I should not, in the scope of this video, take any firm position on which view is correct. But with that said, I myself prefer the Millian view of propositions. And one day I would love to write something or make a video to defend this, but I cannot do that today. Instead, for this video, let's just take it as an unargued assumption, for the sake of argument, that the Millian perspective on propositions is correct. We can then explore the implications of this assumption for our discussion on theoretical identifications. Now that we have these two positions on the table, it should be relatively straightforward to see how they apply to our story of the Greek astronomer who discovers that Hesperus is phosphorus. When I told the story before, I said that the astronomer gains a new belief when he learns that Hesperus is phosphorus. If we assume the Fregean view of propositions, then that way of telling the story is fine, just as it is. That is because, according to Frege, the belief that Hesperus is phosphorus is distinct from the belief that Hesperus is Hesperus. Remember, Frege's view holds that propositions are fine-grained enough to account for differences of cognitive significance, even when each of the referents of the distinct beliefs are the same. So on the Fregean view, our astronomer really does gain a novel belief that they hadn't possessed before. Lastly, with this perspective, we can hold that the new belief that Hesperus is phosphorus really was based on observation. So assuming the Fregean account of propositions, we still have a claim to a legitimate example of the necessary a posteriori. On the other hand, from the Millian perspective on propositions, things must be different. Remember, according to the Millian, propositions are coarse-grained, and so the belief that Hesperus is phosphorus just is the belief that Hesperus is Hesperus. So in their view, we can't really say that our Greek astronomer has gained a new belief. Our Greek astronomer had already believed all along that Hesperus is Hesperus, and so therefore they also believed that Hesperus is phosphorus, because those two beliefs are literally identical. If we grant that the astronomer knew all along that Hesperus is Hesperus as an a priori fact of logic, it also follows that they knew a priori that Hesperus is phosphorus. Of course, the direct reference theorist fully acknowledges that, prior to the discovery, the astronomer would never express their belief using those exact words in public language. They wouldn't assertively utter the sentence, Hesperus is phosphorus. But that's just because the astronomer doesn't realize that those words, Hesperus and phosphorus, are co-referential. But that's just to say that the astronomer lacks some knowledge about the words Hesperus and phosphorus. That isn't to say that they don't know that Hesperus is phosphorus. From our perspective, that is a perfectly fine way to describe their cognitive situation. Okay, so let me summarize what I've been saying. Basically, we've seen two views on propositions and the individuation of beliefs, Fregeanism and Millianism. If the Fregean view is right, then the Greek astronomer's belief that Hesperus is phosphorus is a fine example of necessary a posteriori knowledge. But if the Millian view is right, then it's no longer clear that we have an example of the necessary a posteriori. That is because the Greek astronomer also knows a priori that Hesperus is phosphorus, by dint of his knowledge of the a priori logical truth that Hesperus is Hesperus. Just as an aside, I don't want to make the strong claim that there's no possible way for the million to give us some sense in which the astronomer's knowledge post-discovery qualifies as a posteriori. But if the million is to do this, they must not say that a priority and a posteriority are intrinsic properties of beliefs. Instead, perhaps they would have to say that a priority and a posteriority are relativized to the guises under which we cognitively encode our beliefs. In fact, that way of talking about things might very well, in the end, be right. But I'm not going to say much more about this option because I don't really know how to finagle the details. Anyway, it's worth saying now that there's a high degree of irony that Frege's position on propositions supports Kripke's argument for the necessary a posteriori better than Mill's position does. That is because Kripke is often read as having constructed powerful arguments against the Fregean position in other parts of his work. He is also often read as being a million, a direct reference theorist, even though, to my knowledge, Kripke never explicitly says that this is what his commitment is. By the way, what I've been telling you is the reason why I remarked earlier that I think that Kripke's best argument for the existence of necessary a posteriori knowledge is the one that comes from the essentialist thesis concerning water and H2O. Although, as I've also said, this isn't how Kripke himself presents his case. So my all things considered position on Kripke's book, Naming a Necessity, is that in the end, I think he reaches the right conclusion. I think that there is such a thing as necessary a posteriori knowledge. But I think he reaches the right conclusion for the wrong reasons. What he should have done is to be more forthright about the essentialist underpinnings of his argument. Okay, so there's one final point that I want to make in this video. But this time, I'm going to try to put forward some of my own ideas. Well, maybe these ideas aren't going to be genuinely original. You never really know in philosophy if you're ever being really original. It seems that everything that could be said in philosophy has already been said by someone. But if it turns out that I'm not being original, then I'll actually be happy, because it means that I'm not saying something that's crazy. All right, so the million view of propositions appears to face a very obvious problem, namely that when we discover a true identity, as in the case of discovering that Hesperus is phosphorus, it feels like we are genuinely learning something that's new. The phenomenology of these discoveries is like that of gaining a new belief. The million needs to offer some explanation of this fact. In other words, the million needs to explain the felt difference in cognitive significance between processing a sentence like Hesperus is phosphorus compared to processing a sentence like Hesperus is Hesperus. In the literature, this problem is called Frege's puzzle. If we were Fregeans, then we would have a very straightforward explanation. For the Fregean, the discovery of an identity feels like gaining a new belief because we are gaining a new belief. But for the million, when we discover that Hesperus is phosphorus, we don't gain any belief that we hadn't already had. So then, why does it feel like a substantive discovery? In my view, the key to solving this problem is to appreciate the division between two levels of psychological explanation. Or in other words, we need to distinguish two ranges of psychological facts. On the one hand, there is the range of facts about beliefs, desires, knowledge. In short, there are the facts about the so-called propositional attitudes. Understanding these facts is the concern of philosophers and semanticists. On the other hand, there are facts about how information gets processed and stored within our brains. Understanding these facts is more of the concern of neuroscience, cognitive science, and psycholinguistics. One way to see that these are different levels of explanation is to consider the thesis of content externalism. It is now widely accepted that a subject's propositional attitudes depend on their external environment and not just what's inside their head. This was argued by Hilary Putnam and Tyler Burge in the 70s. As Putnam famously put it, meaning isn't in the head. This is especially true if you're a million about content, since on this view, propositions are largely composed of external objects and properties. You might put the matter like this. For the million, the facts about a subject's beliefs are really facts about the relations that the subject bears to the objects in their external environment, organized into some sort of propositional structure. In short, the propositional attitudes supervene on both the subject and their environment. But with all of that said, there still needs to be some story about how the stuff that is inside our head processes information. There needs to be a story of what happens in the head in between the moment that light hits our eyes and sound waves hit our ears and the moment that we act on behalf of the information we've received. Again, this is really the job of cognitive science to figure out. It isn't the job of philosophers. But however this story goes, it's going to be a different level of psychological explanation than what's given by the propositional attitudes, because it's going to be solely concerned with internal processing. Perhaps this level of explanation is concerned with the internal aspects that partly ground the propositional attitudes, but it isn't concerned with the propositional attitudes themselves. All right, so now that I've made this distinction between two levels of psychological explanation, let me now tell you an armchair psychology story of what's going on in Frege's puzzle. That is, in discoveries of identities. Just to be clear, I fully accept that it is not the philosopher's job to speculate about how the brain works without doing empirically informed science. My purpose for telling this just so story is to illustrate how this might go, so that I can then defend millionism against Frege's puzzle. All right, let's go back to our example of the astronomer. When the astronomer first observes a star in the evening and dubs it Hesperus, it's plausible to think that their mind does something that's akin to opening a new file folder. You can imagine the astronomer's mind creating a new folder and labeling it the Hesperus file for the purpose of storing all of its Hesperus-related information. Likewise, when the astronomer first discovers the star in the morning and dubs it Phosphorus, you can imagine their minds creating a new phosphorus file for the purpose of storing phosphorus-related information. Since these folders were created separately in different times, they will occupy different locations in the astronomer's mind's filing system. And then, one day, the discovery is made that Hesperus is phosphorus. When this occurs, the astronomer's mind now has to reorganize its information in a fairly substantial way. It has to take all of the Hesperus folder and the phosphorus folder and collect all of that previously disparate information and compile it into a single combined folder. The reason that the discovery that Hesperus is phosphorus feels cognitively significant is because it requires the mind to do a significant update to its filing system. Information that was previously only filed in the phosphorus dossier gets added to the Hesperus dossier, and vice versa. Okay, so that is how I would recommend for the million to explain the felt cognitive significance displayed in Frege's puzzles. Notice, however, that I only stayed at the level of psychological explanation that pertains to the mind's internal processing. I only ever talked about what's inside the head. As such, I never appealed to the idiom of the propositional attitudes. I never said anything about belief or knowledge. But remember, beliefs and knowledge extend beyond what's solely within the subject's head. The propositional attitudes are really about relations that the subject bears to the objects in their environment. And as far as the astronomer's relations to Hesperus goes, we can say that nothing has changed in a way that would constitute a new belief. At least, that's how the Millian would see it. Okay, so let me just summarize my main thesis of this last little part. This all began by noticing that these quote-unquote substantive identity beliefs appear to be awkward for the Millian because they are cognitively significant. My response, on behalf of the Millian, is to agree they are cognitively significant, but their cognitive significance resides at the level of internal information processing. It doesn't reside at the level of the propositional attitudes because those are more of an externalist thing. All right, so I think that's all I'm going to say about this topic for now. I hope that the last thing I just said about Frege puzzles wasn't too crazy, since that was the part of the video that was mostly my own contribution. I think I'll put up a list of papers at the end of this video and books that I mentioned throughout the course of this video. One more book that I didn't mention, but it did help me a lot in thinking about this issue, is this book right here. Volume 2 of Philosophical Analysis in the 20th Century by Scott Soames. Basically, this is a history book of the middle of the 20th century, and it has a lot of great things to say to understand Saul Kripke. Anyway, that's all. That's it for now. See you.